I'm delighted to be joined by Jake. He's an emergency room nurse that has been on the front lines dealing with COVID. Delighted to be joined by an anonymous hospital worker. Been speaking with hospital workers, so some are a little bit more able to give information, others aren't. Obviously, hospitals probably don't love their workers speaking. Dan is a registered nurse, 19 years of experience, master's degree, certification in leadership, was in management at a hospital for 10 years. Last March, went back to being a traveling nurse and currently works in a COVID ICU.
Well, I'm a nurse at Fairview in Minnesota. And I've worked there for about 2 years. They sent us an email recently, part of their communications that they always send out. And this one included an ask for employees to start volunteering their time to help patient-facing employees. So basically other nurses to stock rooms and answer phones and get water for patients instead of, employing people to do that job, like staff that are already employed in the hospital to volunteer their own time outside of work hours. The email was very clear, like it's a volunteer job and it would be outside of your normal work hours. And you would be volunteering your time to come work for the hospital, but just not get paid to do it.
Can you kind of just talk about now with Omicron, give a picture to people, what is the flow like of patients that are coming in? What are you experiencing day to day?
So it's different. This time around feels different. This is, I would say, I don't know, maybe the third or fourth time around that it feels like we've been dealing with surges. But this one just feels different. After Thanksgiving, it was like out of nowhere, people were coming in left and right. Like every other patient had COVID symptoms. The frequency that people have COVID is it's exponentially more than it has been since the beginning of this. For example, I'll take a 3 to 4 person pod any given day in the ER. Up to this point, you'd have a day where you have, of the 3 patients, one of them has COVID. On a bad day, maybe 2. But basically since Thanksgiving, every patient I have a 4 person pod. Every single one of them has COVID.
At the time I left, the ICU was full. There was a lot of death, a lot of mortality. And in checking in with my coworkers over the last several days, last week, they're saying it's the same. Just the severity of the illness that they're seeing is through the roof, running out of space in the morgue, things like that. So yeah, there's an impression out there that Omicron is milder, and overall it may be. And to be fair, working in the ICU, you see all of the worst case scenarios. You don't see the mild cases when you're in a place where all this severe stuff comes in. So the view is a little bit skewed, but certainly the ICU is full and the patients are very, very sick.
ER was essentially slammed one day. I'm talking about stretchers literally lined up one after the other and after the other, almost like a train. Some people wearing their masks, some people not wearing masks. Nurses scrambling, trying to pretty much just put out the fire. So they're dealing with one patient, but then because they're dealing with the one patient too often, another patient gets disgruntled. Tons of COVID signs. Pretty much every floor of my facility, every unit, when you go on, there's guaranteed at least one sign. And if it's not one sign, it's half a unit just covered in these signs, basically saying to wear N95 and to wear personal protection. And that's just in terms of just the COVID volume here, because we had already hit capacity pretty much roughly sometime before the new year. We hadn't even entered the new year and we were already hitting capacity.
I mean, just historically, that's been an issue with ERs. Long wait times, everything kind of gets bottlenecked, right? Because if the hospitals are full, people come to the ER because of EMTALA, which is a rule, which everybody deserves a right to be seen. So we can't say, hey, we're full, come back later. People register, they'll sit in the lobby. Just with current conditions, our hospital is so full. There's nowhere for these patients to go. So the ER essentially turns into an additional nursing floor because there's no beds on the actual floors, which in turn leaves people in the lobby for hours on end because we can't complete the process of admitting patients.
staffing shortages, paid time off not being implemented. Could you kind of talk about kind of from the actual hospital workers side, what has it been like in terms of staffing and things like that?
Staffing shortages. My department, for example, my recent department right now, we were already downsized. And as I just mentioned, we just had 2 people out because of COVID. Back when I worked in the OR, we had staffing shortages. Nurses would get flexed. And what flex means basically is you would come into work and you would either work 4 hours and then go home, or they would send you home almost instantly. There was moments where nurses would literally walk in the door and our nursing directors would pretty much just point them right back out and say, you gotta go. The problem with flexing is that it seized PTO. So if you had any PTO saved, a lot of your PTO wound up getting seized by the hospital.
Instead of hiring more nurses or patient care assistants or whatever it is that they're short-staffed on, they are outsourcing that to volunteers who might show up once, they might show up twice, they probably aren't going to show up every day like an employee would, to do these jobs, because nurses are stretched so thin that I actually don't have time to fill a packet with educational information and then go through it with a patient anymore. I don't have that time. I'm too overworked. Because my last position that I used to have at this hospital is now being advertised to travel nurses for $4,800 some dollars a week. And I made $34 an hour there.
That's one of the challenging things about COVID in general, is even in the beginning of the pandemic, when nobody was vaccinated and there were a lot of big outbreaks in nursing homes and rehabs and prisons and areas of congregate living, mortality was 3% or something. And that's high. That's a lot of mortality, but that still means that 97 out of 100 people don't die from it. So you have 97 people who may not have had very severe illness. Some of those may have been severe. They survived. But, if 80 of them just had cold or flu-like symptoms, that's potentially 80 people who are saying that wasn't so bad. I don't know what the big deal is. But 3% or 1% is still a lot of severe illness. So I don't know what that threshold is that causes hospitals to be full. I'm not sure what percent of illness severity and mortality translates to all the ICUs filling up. But as you said, if Omicron is half as severe as Delta was, but it's 10 times more transmissible, then that translates to a larger actual number of people being sick and ending up in the hospital.
How mild is it when you're actually there and you're seeing, the influx of people, the emergency room being packed with, hours and hours and hours of people waiting? Zero in on that term mild.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about this. I saw a tweet and they said, we think like mild salsa, right? And it's just like, I think people automatically write something off as just like the sniffles or like a cough for a day or two. And when I see mild in the hospital, it's fever. It's really high fever. It's like a rough cough. You can't eat or drink anything because you can't keep it down. You're throwing it up. You're dehydrating. And then, even when you get past like your acute symptoms, a lot of people, even though they have a mild case, they're developing what they call long COVID, which is, the debilitating symptoms that last for months, even, people years from when they got it are still having symptoms. I know people who still can't taste or smell, or if they can, everything tastes awful. People having respiratory issues, neurological issues. I know people who, it's called COVID tachycardia, where their heart just out of nowhere just beats really fast. So, and these people have mild cases. So when we talk about mild, that doesn't necessarily mean you're out of the woods once you get past those acute symptoms that you do experience.
The smallpox vaccine was a huge needle, and you have to be stuck multiple times. It's the kind of thing that anti-vaxxers would lose their minds over today. There's no vaccine in the world, including polio, that's 100% effective in every person. The reason that nobody gets polio is because everybody got vaccinated, and therefore there's no polio around anymore to be exposed to have breakthrough infections. So, people lose that, and they weigh in on things that they don't necessarily have the background to be weighing in on. And there's a lot of misinformation, and it's frustrating.
There's still people on ventilators because we still have ICUs filled with COVID patients. So anyone who's saying that severity is going down, that's not true. In terms of like the number of hospitalizations, not true, because I think I only had one day where we didn't have many people in the ER, and that was only because it was Christmas. If it wasn't Christmas, most likely it would have been still packed. It would have still been jam filled.
Because of the pandemic, was the patients going to the high acuity ICUs were so sick, they needed to make room for those patients, and as a result, they would transfer out patients who were of a lesser acuity, but still very sick, and not really the type of patients that you would normally send out of the ICU. And so those patients get bumped out to maybe a step down or an intermediate care. They need to make room, so their patients end up going to a regular floor. Patients from the regular med surg floors end up bumped out to the long-term cares, and there's just this cascading effect of higher acuity patients ending up in situations that they wouldn't normally end up in.
Like, we're not robots, we're not machines. Like, we're only human. We can only do so much. It starts to wear on your psyche when you go in there day in and day out, and you got people's lives in your hands, and you feel like you can only do so much, and things might happen.
There hasn't been a period where you guys could regroup, not just physically, but the mental component on hospital workers, nurses, burnout, PTSD from the mass death you're seeing. Can you kind of talk about where, I know you're not particularly a nurse, but obviously you're in the environment. Can you kind of talk about the mental component here? Because it's similar to war. I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but what you guys are seeing is very similar to wartime conditions.
It is. And even when I first started, when this all first began, I remember one of the first few things one of my coworkers was saying was we're at war, we're on the front lines, we're basically, put out there to survive this thing and essentially counter it. So it definitely is like wartime. It definitely burnout was one of my major things. I experienced major burnout, especially when I was in the OR, due to the nature of my job, between the demands from the nurses, between dealing with the virus itself. Staff shortages started before COVID. They already had a nursing staff shortage before this. But then because of COVID, because the nurses got tired of being mistreated or not being paid, or in the case I was talking about earlier, flexed, because I knew one nurse, he was flexed to the point where he said he might as well have been fired because that's might as well what they had done. We already had those type of issues. My hospital in general would have moments where they called them rifts, where they would freeze hiring, not hire new people, fire a bunch of people, then undo the freeze, and then hire people.
Wow.
So you already had staffing shortages at hospitals. That's what I mean by the infrastructure. I won't even say the infrastructure is crumbling. It is collapsed. It's collapsed pretty much. Like, people trying to act like that this thing is going to maintain itself. It's not. Realistically, it is not. And COVID just accelerated it, if anything.